This is Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Dawn Tan. Tonight's top stories. Myanmar's military spells out punishments of up to 20 years in jail for protesters as Aung San Suu Kyi's detention is extended. With just months to go, a survey shows over half of Japanese firms want the Tokyo Olympics cancelled or postponed. A highly contagious UK variant of COVID-19 hits New Zealand. Officials are still unclear how it entered the country. The arrest of a young Indian climate activist stirs outrage in India. 22-year-old Disha Ravi is accused of sedition for promoting the farmers' protests. And a smooth start to the UK's hotel quarantine regime as the government considers how fast it can exit the current COVID-19 lockdown.
Hello there, Motili Edwards. Also tonight, Malaysia to unveil its COVID-19 vaccination rollout plan. Dozens missing after a deadly landslide in Java. At least 9 people have been killed.
I'm Elizabeth Nyo with your Asia Business Update. Private home sales in Singapore for January hit a 2-year high. Plus, Japan, Thailand record their sharpest contraction in years as pandemic-induced lockdowns make their mark.
Myanmar's military has laid out punishments for protesters that include jail terms of up to 20 years. Despite an overnight internet shutdown and stronger military presence, people are still protesting on the streets. At the same time, the detention of Aung San Suu Kyi has been extended. She's expected to appear in court later this week.
A stronger military presence on the streets has not stopped defiant protesters from gathering in Myanmar cities for a 10th straight day. The fresh protests followed the extension of ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi's detention.
Social media မှာတက်တဲ့သတင်းအရာရောနောက်ပြီးတော့အဲ့ဒီယမန်ရှောက်တဲ့စာရွက်အရာဒီနေ့ထိယူထားတယ်ဆိုတော့ဒါယမန်ကုန်တဲ့ရက်ပဲဆိုပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့လာပြီးတော့ပါဝါတင်ဖို့လာတာပါဒါပေမဲ့KIA တရားသူကြီးနဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့လုပ်ပါတယ်ဆွေးနွေးပါတယ်အဲ့တော့သူပြောပြချက်အရာဆိုပြီးယမန်က18ရက်နေ့ထိပထမကျွန်တော်တင်တဲ့ဥစ္စာအမှန်ပါ18ရက်နေ့ထိထားတော့အဲ့တော့ဒီကနေ့မဟုတ်ဘူးပြီးတော့တင်မယ်ဆိုရင်လည်းဟိုမှာတင်ပါမယ်စမူတီရီမျိုးနဲ့တရားရုံးနောက်တစ်ခါဗီဒီယိုကွန်ဖရင့်စီနဲ့လုပ်ပါ
The internet connection is back up and running after a total shutdown, taking Myanmar almost entirely offline for at least 8 hours. The information blackout has fueled fears of a military crackdown. Armored vehicles, water cannon, and trucks have also been seen rolling into Yangon. More soldiers have also been seen on the streets.
ဒီနေ့ဆိုရင်လည်းကျွန်တော်တို့အရင်ပြနေကြပုံစံနဲ့မတူဘဲနဲ့ရဲကားမဟုတ်ဘဲနဲ့စစ်ကားတွေပါရောက်နေပါတယ်သူတို့ဘက်ကဒီဗဟိုဘဏ်နဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့လုံခြုံရေးကိုတအားတင်းကျပ်ထားပုံရပါတယ်ခင်ဗျ။ဘာကြောင့်တင်းကျပ်ထားလဲဆိုတော့ဗဟိုဘဏ်ကကြတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့နိုင်ငံကြီးရဲ့ငွေကြေးလက်မှတ်မှုရန်ရာကြီးမှာအသက်သွေးကြောဖြစ်နေတဲ့အတွက်အဲ့ဒီဗဟိုဘဏ်ရန်ရာကြီးရပ်တန့်သွားမှာဆိုလို့ကိုသူတို့တွေဒီသူတို့ကာဗာလုပ်တဲ့အနေနဲ့ဗဟိုဘဏ်ရှိမှာစစ်တပ်တစ်ခုလုံးကိုတက်ဆွဲထားတဲ့အပြင်ကျွန်တော်တို့တင့်ကားတွေပါနေပါတယ်
Protesters around the country have vowed to press on with their civil disobedience campaign, demanding for the civilian government to be restored. More than 400 people have been arrested since the coup.
Let's bring in Leong Wai Kit, who joins us live now with more details on this story. Wai Kit, the military has also spelled out new laws to crack down on protesters. What do these entail?
Well, Dawn, these rules, these new laws really target the ongoing protests as well as the civil disobedience movement. For instance, if you now go out to protest on the streets and you hold a card that says, for instance, down with the army, then you face 20 years jail. If you disrupt a government's servant's work, for instance, a public healthcare worker or a bank worker, then you face 7 years jail. That, of course, can be linked to the ongoing civil disobedience movement where people are calling for strikes. And, of course, in recent days, we've seen how citizens are banding together to resist arrest or to resist the security forces' request for them to start work. And if they do that now, they risk 20 years jail. Now, if we take a step back and look at what's been introduced so far, the military government has given itself wider powers to arrest without needing any witness, or to detain a person longer without needing a court order, or to go into a person's house or building to search without needing a warrant. Now, on a local level, the authorities are also trying to stop people from harboring fugitives. So, for instance, if you have people staying overnight at your house, they're from out of town or they're not in your household, you will have to report that to the authorities, or that would constitute an offence.
So a significant tightening of restrictions. But meanwhile, Wai Kit, Aung San Suu Kyi's detention has also been extended. Do we know why that is?
That's an interesting question, because it appears that Ms. Suu Kyi's defense lawyer, he himself seems to be taken off guard by the turn of events, because we know that February 15 is the expiry date of her detention, Ms. Suu Kyi and Win Myint. And of course, today we learned that it's February 17 instead. The defense lawyer, in fact, has been trying to make inroads to meet our leaders, Aung San Suu Kyi and Win Myint, because as their clients, they have the right to meet the defense lawyer, but he has not been given access to meet two of them. As of now, of course, we know for sure, or at least we know with a greater certainty, that they will be appearing in court via online platforms on February 17.
All right, Wai Kit, thank you very much for that update. Long Wai Kit there with that update. Well, a closer look at the impact of the internet shutdown in Myanmar later on Asia Tonight.
In other news, Tokyo is due to host the world's biggest sporting event in less than 6 months. But a new survey says that half of Japanese companies want the Olympics postponed or cancelled. It's another blow to the already troubled Games. Tokyo remains in a state of emergency after a surge in COVID-19 cases. Michio Ishida reports.
For a few months now, media polls show that around 80% of the public wants the Olympic Games postponed again or cancelled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But a fresh new survey by think tank Tokyo Shoko Research shows a similar sentiment is shared by 56% of Japanese companies. That's a slight increase from the survey in July last year. Only 7.7% want the Olympic Games held this July. This is not good for Tokyo, as the biggest income is expected from corporate sponsors. The second biggest income would come from spectators or tickets. If the games are held, 37% of surveyed companies think spectators should be limited or with no spectators. The survey covered 11,000 companies conducted for a week in early February. But won't the cancellation or postponement of the games hurt corporate income? Well, close to 70% of firms say they don't think so. For the new president of the organizing committee, who will replace gaffe-prone Mr. Yoshiro Mori, it will be a great challenge to draw public and corporate support. Election is expected to take place as early as this week. That's as there is no clear sight when the state of emergency on 10 prefectures will be lifted. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
The UK variant of the coronavirus has made its way to New Zealand. Auckland has just finished day one of a 72-hour lockdown. Authorities are hopeful it won't have to be extended.
The streets of Auckland are largely empty as the city's 2 million people stay home under lockdown again. With businesses and schools closed, the only crowds seen are at coronavirus testing centres. New Zealand is rushing to find out how the highly contagious UK variant of COVID-19 entered its shores. It's been detected in 2 of the country's 3 community cases, all belonging to the same family. The initial focus is on the mother's workplace, a company providing laundry services to international flights because of what authorities call obvious connections to the border. But they aren't ruling out other possibilities.
We're already reaching out to those international airlines to see whether or not they have results from any of their air crew that could be a match, and equally reaching out to our overseas counterparts that do sequence passengers who disembark and go into isolation at other destinations. So, for instance, in Australia, to see if we can find a match there.
Authorities say testing of the family's close contacts has so far found no other cases. That's raised hopes the lockdown will end within 3 days as planned. At the same time, the country's first batch of vaccines has arrived. 60,000 Pfizer-BioNTech jabs will go to frontline workers like airline and hotel staff, nurses and border officials. It will be rolled out from Saturday following quality checks.
2 million people in Vietnam will be ordered to stay home for 2 weeks from tomorrow. The northern province of Hai Duong has become the center of a new coronavirus outbreak. Residents will only be allowed to head out for essentials. Workers at factories and production can continue with their jobs, but gatherings of more than 2 people will be banned. Schools, bars, restaurants and karaoke lounges will be shut. Vietnam's latest outbreak has been linked to the new, more contagious variants of COVID-19. Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh have both ordered schools closed for the rest of the month.
Malaysia's Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin will unveil a handbook for the country's COVID-19 immunisation plan tomorrow. Mass vaccinations will begin later this month. Melissa Goh with this report.
Parent Azlan Arwith can't wait for the vaccine rollout in Malaysia. Teachers, he said, should be among the first to get vaccinated so that children can return to school sooner than later.
Yeah, I'm confident now because everybody has to play the part and to trust the government. It's been used throughout the world, so shouldn't be a problem.
But others are still skeptical.
They rush the vaccine. Normally vaccine has a long process and all that, so I'm not really that sure.
Not that keen, huh?
Not that keen, really.
Quite scared also because we have to see our ministers. Let them to try first. If they are okay, then let us take.
Yeah.
Both Colin and Sadev are dispatch riders, and one of their colleagues had just been tested positive. They are among millions of fence-sitters that Coordinating Minister Hairi Jamaluddin is still trying to convince ahead of vaccine rollout this year.
According to a recent KKM survey that was done online, the acceptance rate was 67% keen to take the vaccine. But there are a significant number who are not sure yet. Various communication strategy that we are devising to ensure that people are comfortable when it comes to the safety of the vaccine, when it comes to the efficacy of the vaccine, when it comes to the halalness of the vaccine.
Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin will be among the first to be vaccinated when the first batch of vaccines arrive end of February. The country has so far secured enough vaccines for more than 27 million, or 80% of its population. The authorities aim to vaccinate 126,000 a day across 600 locations nationwide. Several dry runs were held, including in rural areas, to ensure vaccines that require sub-zero temperature are properly handled.
Now, some 500,000 frontliners will get their vaccines first, followed by the high-risk group, and more than 9 million of them comprising the elderly, the sick and persons with disabilities. Now, while the rest of the population, for those aged 18 and above, will get their vaccines beginning May this year to February next year.
Registration is scheduled to begin later this week. While it's not compulsory, vaccination is free for both locals and foreigners, including undocumented migrant workers and refugees.
And the principle is very simple. The principle is we need to vaccinate the foreign workers to make sure that they are safe and to make sure that we are also safe.
Malaysia has more than 3 million migrant workers, mainly in plantation, construction and manufacturing sectors. Melissa Goh, CNA, Kuala Lumpur.
Hello there. In business tonight, more than 1,600 new private homes were sold in Singapore last month. That is the highest monthly sales notched in more than 2 years. It's also a 30% increase from December and 2.5 times the number of units sold in January 2020. The strong demand was anchored by 2 new launches, in particular Normanton Park, that's located near Kent Ridge, and the Reef at King's Dock, that's located near the harbourfront area. They accounted for more than half of the total sales in the month. Analysts say the rise in demand may also be a reaction to potential cooling measures, with more hoping to jump into the market before possible restrictions are introduced.
Some buyers, they could be rushing in to secure units now ahead of possible property curbs, especially those who were sitting on the fence. they've decided to buy a unit now because their buying eligibility or borrowing limits could be affected by the new cooling measures. Some buyers may feel that it would be better to buy a unit sooner rather than later because prices of homes may likely rise as the global economy, especially Singapore's economy, is expected to pick up further this year.
And Singapore is sticking to its previous GDP growth forecast of between 4% and 6% for this year. This despite a recession last year and new coronavirus variants that could shut borders for much longer. And the Trade and Industry Ministry says it looked at factors that could spur recovery at home and abroad. For instance, faster vaccine rollouts in certain advanced economies like the US and EU could mean population immunity by the second half of this year. At the same time, Singapore's COVID-19 situation is under control with mass vaccination also underway. But because of a surge in global cases slowing the reopening of countries, the ministry says the recovery ahead will be uneven.
Outward-oriented sectors such as manufacturing and wholesale trade are projected to benefit from the pickup in external demand. However, tourism and aviation-related sectors are likely to see a weaker recovery due to the slower than anticipated lifting of global travel restrictions, while consumer-facing sectors such as retail and food and beverage are expected to recover this year. They are not likely to return to pre-COVID levels by end of 2021 because of the slower recovery in visitor arrivals.
Singapore's economy shrank 5.4% last year. It beat a previous advance estimate of minus 5.8% and came out better than the government's forecast range of between minus 6 and minus 6.5%. Still, it was the first full-year contraction in 2 decades and worst recession since independence. Budget support measures worth close to $100 billion were rolled out to save jobs and livelihoods. So far, these have halved the impact of COVID-19 on GDP growth, according to an interim report. Singapore's budget will be named Emerging Stronger Together. It will focus on how the country can come out of the COVID-19 crisis stronger and forge partnerships to meet the challenges as one people. Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat shared this in a Facebook post a day before he delivers the budget statement. He says Singapore must find new ways to innovate and transform the economy, strengthen the social compact, and support those with greater needs. He also highlights the importance of tackling climate change, all while continuing to be prudent in spending. Singapore will end the financial year with a record budget deficit. And Mr. Heng explains that the country was able to fund this deficit by tapping on past reserves built up by earlier generations. But he warns that Singapore's fiscal situation will continue to be tight in the coming years. Our coverage of the budget on CNA begins at 2:30 p.m. Singapore-Hong Kong time. Together with the minister's budget speech, there will be analysis of key announcements made. Japan's pandemic-hit economy shrank for the first time in more than a decade last year. It was down 4.8% from the year before, and the country ended 2020 on a strong note thanks to a pickup in consumption, exports and government spending. The world's third largest economy grew 12.7% on year in the fourth quarter. That was when government support measures of about $3 trillion started to provide relief, and that's the second straight quarter of growth. The better-than-forecast data helped Tokyo's Nikkei 225 break 30,000 for the first time in more than 3 decades. Analysts warn that the near-term outlook could be bumpy. Fresh virus restrictions are threatening to dampen domestic consumption. Borders are also still closed to tourists with less than 6 months before the postponed Olympics. Thailand's economy shrank at its fastest pace in over 2 decades as COVID-19 gutted the tourism industry and exports. Last year's 6.1% contraction was the worst since the 1997 Asian financial crisis. The ongoing anti-government protests are also weighing on growth. Officials expect the economy to expand at a much slower pace this year. They forecast at 2.5 to 3.5% growth. That's down from the 3.5 to 4.5% growth previously estimated. Partial lockdowns have hit the economy hard. Some 40 million tourists were expected to arrive in 2020, but international travel was halted. The government has approved an extra $1.2 billion in stimulus to get things going. This will include a 4,000 baht payment to more than 9 million low-income workers, and that is on top of a recent $7 billion scheme for about 31 million people. Luxury car brand Jaguar has joined the race to roll out clean energy vehicles. It's planning to produce only electric vehicles from 2025. The Tata Motors-owned Jaguar Land Rover Group also aims to be net zero on carbon emissions by 2039. Nissan says it is not in talks with Apple to make self-driving cars. It's denied reports that Apple approached it about a potential tie-up, but says it is always open to exploring partnerships. This comes a week after Hyundai also denied similar reports. Apple's Project Titan is devoted to electric autonomous vehicles. It's been in the works for years, but details of the venture have been secret. Nissan shares in Tokyo slid nearly 3% on that news. Australia's Seven West Media has become the first major news outlet to strike a licensing deal with Google. It will allow its content to be hosted on Google News Showcase for $23 million a year. The Australian government is pushing ahead with proposed new rules to force tech giants like Google and Facebook to pay media companies for content. Both tech giants have slammed the law, which aims to address the loss of advertising revenue from traditional media companies to online ones. Now, Bitcoin has pulled back from a record high as investors took profits from a rally that pushed the digital currency close to $50,000. Other cryptocurrencies also slipped. Bitcoin fell as much as 5.6% to slightly under $46,000. That was after it reached a peak of about $49,700. It's now down about 2.5%. Rival Ethereum slid more than 8%, but it has recovered slightly. Bitcoin is fast gaining legitimacy as an asset class. It has gained more than 1,100% since hitting a one-year low last March. It jumped 20% in the week since Tesla said it had invested $1.5 billion in a cryptocurrency and would start accepting it as payment. Morgan Stanley's investment arm is also reportedly weighing a bet on Bitcoin as well. And that's your business update for now. Back to you, Terry.
Thanks very much, Liz. Outrage in India after a young climate activist was arrested on sedition charges. 22-year-old Disha Ravi is accused of circulating a document online to help farmers protest against the Modi government's agricultural laws. Now, if found guilty, she could face life in prison. Police say the 22-year-old is a key conspirator. They say the document she shared aims to spread discontent against the Indian state. The toolkit had basic information on the protests, as well as instructions on how to join rallies and support the movement online. It was first shared by prominent activist Greta Thunberg. Opposition parties and activists have condemned her detention, calling it an escalation on the government's crackdown on free speech. Disha's arrest is trending on Twitter, with protests planned in support of her release. Police have been cracking down on the farmers' protests in recent weeks. Tens of thousands have taken part in rallies for months. They say the government's plans to reform the sector benefits only big corporations. Updating tonight's top stories, over half of Japanese firms believe the Tokyo Olympics should be cancelled or postponed. The new survey results cast more doubt on the fate of the troubled games. Myanmar's military has laid out punishments for protesters that include jail terms of up to 20 years. Despite an overnight internet shutdown and stronger military presence, people are still protesting on the streets. And ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi's detention has been extended. She will remain in custody until a court hearing on Wednesday.
For more on the situation in Myanmar, Kah Ho Yeo from Verisk Maplecraft joins us live now. Mr. Yeo, what's the rationale behind this overnight internet shutdown that we've seen in Myanmar, and why was it restored again this morning?
The internet was restricted when the civil unrest were taking shape and when the police was stepping up their operations. So the internet interruption was more about a technical move to hinder the public from using the internet to organize the campaign and to live stream the response of the police and army. However, it is very hard for the military to cut the internet entirely for a very long time, and because this is an essential service to the country. And that's why we do see them restore it quite quickly.
Also, Mr. Yu, the nationwide civil disobedience campaign seems to be growing, but are we any closer to the end of the escalation in Myanmar given these new laws?
No, we don't expect the civil unrest to end that soon, and it is kind of disrupting the daily work of a lot of business or even the government departments. But if the civil unrest continue, we expect it will also harm the essential functioning of the country. The government can somehow take over some of the daily operations for some hospitals, but they can't really manage everything. For example, let's say the financial setup. And we do expect the tension will continue, the mistrust will stay in place, and eventually it will continue to escalate.
Well, the repercussions on foreign business interests in Myanmar has been a concern since this coup began on Feb 1st. Could the ongoing strike perhaps impact foreign investment further in the country?
Yeah, it makes a lot of business very difficult. I think the key problem here is more about the international responses, sanctions, or the reputational risk. The foreign business they don't really have a choice, but they have to continue to do business or to source from the military-affiliated local partners, which is very likely to expose them to reputational risk or even sanctions. And what we see here is that the tension is remaining, the mistrust is remaining, and a key uncertainty is more about the international sanctions. Although the sanctions on the military leaders will likely have limited impact, however, it will become very hard for the responsible companies, especially the international ones, to keep operate or to source from Myanmar.
Let's just turn our attention to Aung San Suu Kyi's detention now. That has been extended to at least Wednesday. Firstly, do you expect the military, to hold her for longer, and also the international community's response to that?
I think extending her detention will simply intensify the tension between the public and the central government. Releasing her may ease a little bit, but it won't brings people together or make peace, because the mistrust is one of the key obstacles to any peace resolution. And the key political uncertainty is here, because even though a lot of different parties they want to move forward to promote peace, but it is really difficult because the mistrust or the tension between the public and the central government is the root cause of a lot of things. This means that it will make a lot of policy making in the future very difficult. And again, we do expect the international community will continue to give pressure to the military, but it is somehow the impact will be quite limited because they are already under a list of sanctions already. But it will have a bigger impact on international companies in the region because they are trying to adhering to the international best practice.
Good to know. Thanks very much for speaking to us. Kah Ho Yu, Senior Asia Analyst at Global Risk Consultancy Verisk Maplecroft. Next, Britain's new mandatory hotel quarantine rule has come into force. All citizens and permanent residents arriving from high-risk countries will have to self-isolate for 10 days. They'll have to pay for it themselves. And during that time, they will have to take several COVID-19 tests. The rule aims to prevent new strains from spreading in the country. At the same time, Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he will soon make a decision on how fast England can exit its lockdown. 15 million of its most vulnerable people have had their first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. From this week, the vaccine program will be expanded to more groups. And Ollie Barrett joins us live now from London. So, Ollie, how has the rollout of the new rules been so far?
Well, the first passengers have started arriving at airports and have made their way under escort, really, to the hotel quarantine where they'll be staying for the next 10 days at their own expense. There have been some teething problems over the last few days with the website through which people book their own quarantine stay. And there are concerns as well being levelled at the government by the opposition Labour Party, who say that this mandatory hotel quarantine should be enforced for all international arrivals and not just those people coming back from so-called red-listed countries. Those countries are chosen by the UK government on the basis of concerns about whether new variants are spreading in those places and therefore trying to keep those new variants out of the United Kingdom as much as possible. But there are also concerns being raised by the opposition Labour Party about how exactly this quarantine policy is going to play out for the people that are heading straight to hotels. They go there with other passengers on a bus. They've been mixing in airports. They've been mixing on the aeroplanes on which they arrive in the UK as well. So very much we will have to wait and see how all this plays out in the coming days. The government insists these measures are tough enough, are rigorous enough. Critics, as I say, wonder why this policy wasn't brought in many months ago.
Also, we know that the UK is already looking at vaccine certificates to help Britain's travel. What's the progress on that?
Well, this has been a confusing picture in recent days as well. We've heard very different messages from different government ministers. The picture seems to be emerging of a situation in which the government is involved in discussions with a number of other countries about the idea of vaccine passports of some sort to allow international travel once it gets to a point where international travel can start to resume in a more meaningful way than we are seeing at the moment. But what Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said today is that the government is not looking at vaccine passports for domestic use for things like going to the pub or other ways in which that kind of idea might be rolled out for the domestic economy. But at the same time, it is very much the case that private enterprises and businesses are looking at whether they can use some kind of vaccine documentation to open up, and that perhaps some businesses may ask for people to prove that they've been vaccinated before they can use their services. So, as I say, a slightly confusing picture at the moment. The government doesn't want to bring in a blanket vaccine passport for domestic use for the whole economy, but they are certainly going to be used in some form and by some businesses.
Also, the PM, Boris Johnson, he's also expected to assess the lockdown this week. Any confusing picture on that front?
Well, the government at the moment is saying that it's too early to say exactly how the easing of lockdown is going to look, but we are getting some sense of what kind of programme the government is considering. The timeline of this is that it is this week that the government expects to get some really helpful data about the vaccination programme and the effects that the vaccination programme is having on the numbers in terms of cases and hospitalisations and fatalities. Now, cases, hospitalisations and deaths are falling rapidly in the UK, but up to this point, the scientists have believed that that is largely to do with the lockdown that is in place in the United Kingdom at the moment, rather than the vaccination programme. But the data we start to see this week should start to show exactly the effect that the vaccination is having, not just on cases, hospitalisations and deaths, but also on the transmission of COVID-19. And once that data comes in, the government will have a better sense of exactly what restrictions it will be able to ease and when. But Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is saying that March the 8th remains the target to start opening schools. And after that, the government will be looking at things like hospitality, exercise, non-essential retail as well. But it doesn't look like anything will be opening up in terms of easing of lockdown before that March the 8th date. Boris Johnson will set out much more detail on all of this next Monday.
All right, many thanks, Ollie Barrett there, speaking to us from London. In other news, as many as 2,000 Rohingyas have begun their journey to a remote Bay of Bengal island. Bangladesh plans to relocate around 3,000 to 4,000 refugees from camps in Cox's Bazar over the next couple of days. Well, that's despite concerns about the risk of storms and floods lashing Bhasanchar Island. Bangladesh maintains the relocation is voluntary and is meant to help ease congestion at the overcrowded Cox's Bazar refugee camp. 7,000 Rohingyas have been sent to the island since December. Bangladesh aims to eventually house up to 100,000 on Bhasanchar.
South Korea says that it won't use AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine on people aged 65 and older. It says there isn't enough data proving its efficacy on the elderly. Now, the move could impact the country's vaccination plans. It had aimed to complete vaccinating 1.3 million people by the first quarter of the year, beginning with healthcare workers and the elderly later this month. But it has now slashed that target by nearly half. Still, the government says that it believes that it will be able to reach its goal of herd immunity by November. At the same time, safe distancing measures are gradually being eased. Restaurants in Seoul can now open till later, while nightclubs and bars, they'll be allowed to reopen for the first time since November last year. Seoul is still the center of new outbreaks of the virus. Nearly 80% of the new cases reported over the Lunar New Year holiday were in the capital. Thailand has discovered its first case of the South African variant of COVID-19. It was detected in a man undergoing mandatory quarantine after arriving from Tanzania. The man is among 143 new infections reported today. Thailand still plans to roll out AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine, despite data showing that it's less effective for that variant. Thai Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha and his administration are facing their second no-confidence motion. Parliament is holding a censure debate this week. Saksith Sayasombat with this report.
It's the second time in just as many years that the opposition in Thailand's parliament is taking aim at the government of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha. This time, 10 ministers, including Mr. Prayut himself, are in the firing line over the course of several days of grilling before a no-confidence vote on each of them at the very end. The opposition accuses the government of malpractice, of corruption, mishandling of the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic, and other failings, both personal and political. But one issue that stands out this time in the original motion for the censure debate is the claim that Prime Minister Prayut is, quote, breaking the bond between the people and the monarchy, saying that the government is hiding behind the officially revered institution for its own failures. Anti-government protests from last year calling for wholesale political reforms, including of the monarchy, have continued last week. The government is accused of hitting back with a flurry of charges, including reviving the draconian royal defamation law that criminalizes criticism of the monarchy with up to 15 years in prison, essentially utilizing the law to gag the protesters. 4 activists are now in pre-trial detention, as protesters are threatening more rallies should they not be released this week. And given that it is a highly sensitive subject, there has already been a lot of heated debate whether this issue should be brought up at all in the censure debate or not. Government coalition MPs are unsurprisingly already up in arms about it and have threatened with legal consequences if they don't drop the matter from the censure debate, while others caution the opposition that they're here to grill the government, not the monarchy. But it is very likely that the government will survive the no-confidence vote, as it commands a comfortable majority in parliament. The opposition still claims that it has a, quote, knockout punch ready, but it remains to be seen whether or not they will be able to land a fatal blow against the government. Saksit Sayasombat, CNA Bangkok.
Japan's Miyagi and Fukushima prefectures are still without water, 2 days after a powerful earthquake hit the region. Authorities are trying to repair a major water pipe that burst because of the tremor. A dozen people are seriously injured after the quake landslides and had damaged buildings. Officials have forecast heavy rain and warned the downpour could trigger more landslides, especially in parts where the earthquake has already loosened the ground.
A former South Korean Coast Guard chief has been cleared of negligence over a botched rescue operation during the Sewol ferry disaster 7 years ago. 9 other current and former Coast Guard officials have also been acquitted. More than 300 people died when the ship capsized. Most were students on a school trip. The court ruled that the Coast Guard officials made an appropriate call to issue an evacuation order, but many on board followed instructions from the ship's crew to stay in their cabins as the ferry slowly sank.
9 people have been killed after rains triggered a landslide on Indonesia's main island of Java. Hundreds of rescuers and volunteers are scrambling to search for 10 others still missing. Some emergency crews are digging with their bare hands to help unearth more victims. The landslide damaged infrastructure and buried at least 8 homes.
The UK-EU divorce is turning ugly for businesses. Many are struggling with new red tape and customs costs as the post-Brexit reality begins to bite. Lucy Hough with this report.
This shoe shop in Paris has been selling British designs to the French for over 40 years. It's developed a loyal customer base for its stock of well-known labels imported from the UK. But hot on the heels of the UK's exit from the single market, the new red tape and paperwork is now piling up, and the slowdown at the border is being felt.
Since the beginning of January, we don't receive as quickly as usual our order. The manufacturer sends the goods, but the goods are stocked to the carrier, DHL, for example, and they are doing the collect and the taxes, the new taxes for Europe. Until now, we have like 1 month of delay.
One survey says 60% of manufacturing firms have reported disruption since January the 1st due to complex new paperwork and extra costs. At the ports, British meat exporters say shipments have rotted in trucks whilst waiting for EU health checks. Scottish fishermen are throwing away catch they can no longer sell to the EU.
Some of this is teething troubles, but analysts say this is just the start of a long-term economic shift.
There are going to be new costs for businesses trading between the UK and the EU. Those will go on indefinitely. And to a great extent, those costs can't really be avoided. They're the costs of having to fill out customs declarations and hire customs brokers and expand your compliance divisions to make sure that you're filling out the forms correctly, and getting certification if you're sending over meat or plant products or anything like that. None of those things will ever go away as long as the UK remains outside the single market and the customs union.
Small and medium-sized businesses are being worst affected as they absorb the extra time and costs. Some specialist online retailers in the EU have said they'll no longer deliver to the UK because of the changes. Others, like the owner of this clothing label in Suffolk, are shouldering the extra costs themselves.
So we're going from 20 to 30 EU sales per week to 0 or 1 or 2 if somebody's really keen to get something. But the 1 or 2 that we are shipping, we're now shipping as a duty-paid item, and I am picking up the costs to get those customers their goods.
The pile-ups at border crossings have until now been avoided, with many firms stockpiling due to Brexit and the coronavirus pandemic. But as the flow of goods picks up, more disruption could follow. For businesses like this one that depend on trade with the UK, the new rules are an uncomfortable fit. Lucy Hough, CNA, Brussels.
Overcoming the pandemic and emerging from it stronger is the best homage Singaporeans can pay to their forefathers. Well, that's the message from Singapore's Education Minister at the 54th War Memorial Service. It commemorates civilian victims of the Japanese occupation, as well as Total Defence Day.
At some point, the pandemic will pass, and at some point it will be over. At that time, I hope we can look back and say that this has been a defining moment in our history. We have been tested in this crucible, but we have overcome the toughest of circumstances together with resilience and resolve, and we have prevailed and forged a stronger sense of solidarity and unity.
This service is held every year on the day Singapore fell to the Japanese in 1942. 50 representatives, including those from religious organizations, attended the service at the Civilian War Memorial.
1,
The UAE's space probe has sent home its first image of Mars. The spacecraft successfully entered the red planet's orbit last week. The photo was snapped nearly 25,000 kilometers above the Martian surface. And it highlights some of the planet's most distinctive traits. One example is the Olympus Mons, seen at the center here, emerging into the early morning sunlight. It's the largest volcano in the solar system. The UAE is now the 5th country to reach the red planet. It's also a first for the Arab world. HOPE will orbit Mars for about 2 years. Later this week, another rover will touch down on Mars. NASA's Perseverance will scour for signs of ancient life and collect dozens of samples. NASA is targeting to send the first humans there in the next decade.
Well, it looks like Rafael Nadal has moved a step closer to a record-setting 21st Grand Slam title. He has defeated Fabio Fognini in straight sets at the Australian Open. Stamping his authority to take the first set, Nadal was put to work in a second. Nadal winning a spectacular rally there to lead. The cool Spaniard playing cleaner than his fiery Italian opponent, racing ahead in a third set before sealing the win at 6-3, 6-4, 6-2.
You can't expect to go on court and to don't have problems during the match, facing these kind of players. So it's normal that in the second set, I don't think I played a good game. When he break me, I was lucky to have the break back immediately, and then I saved a love for it. That was the key,
Russian fourth seed Daniil Medvedev is also in the quarterfinals for the first time. He defeated American Mackenzie McDonald in straight sets. It will be an all-Russian matchup next for him after Andrei Rublev got through as well. An upset in women's action after fifth seed Ukrainian Elina Svitolina crashed out. She lost to Jessica Pegula, who's on a fairy tale run, after also knocking out two-time Australian Open champion Victoria Azarenka in her first match. And hope continues for a home winner as Australian Ashley Barty pulled all the stops against the big-hitting Shelby Rogers. In a clinical display, top-ranked Barty won in straight sets, 6-3, 6-4.
Still lots to play for there. Well, this has been Asia Tonight. Headlines anytime at CNA.Asia.
And you can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Good night.
Bye for now.